My name is Tony Mitchell, and I've just had a collection of my poems published in an anthology called Life's Lines. These poems have been written between 1953 and today in a variety of styles and formats. They reflect my lifelong fascination with words, fueling a hobby and a professional life as an English lecturer. I've chosen one of those poems to explore with you. It is a poem about my father and some of his experiences as a young man, which he said little about. It is centred on a stately home in Northern Ireland and features others in London and Durham, all belonging to the Londonderry family. It includes experiences with two dictators who seriously threatened to invade this country. This is the poem which I will read to you. Tir nan og. My father walked these grounds 90 years ago, where I would be but a boy once more, and my father in his prime. Learned to drive a car with him and sail a yacht on Strangford Loch. But the wind, sun and rain have changed them again, and the past is beyond recall. Lord and Lady Londonderry lie behind their gated walls, a formal mausoleum inscribed with Tir nan og, a mythic land where none grow old. The wind, sun and rain mask the ongoing pain as defiant memorials fade. The past is beyond recall. Mary, Mary, far from contrary, stepped down from the towering years, Brock's three-headed child, now a gracious lady in a tea-room at Mount Stewart. Oh, I remember Harry Mitchell. The rhododendra and azaleas splashed their colours profusely on the garden's formal patterns, nature's orchestrations. A beauty built on blackness, dark dreams of Durham sea coal, sounds that time forgot, and poor folks suffering. With Castlereagh, whose penknife closed his heady days of splendour in Vienna, and the nightmare of Napoleon. A century before, Dame Edith formed the Women's Legion and worked for women's suffrage. Glittering Park Lane parties were butlered by my father. Then Nazis sat with King and Queen, Schutzstaffel romped by Strangford Loch, and peace was sought with Hermann Goering. As fragile as the porcelain Himmler liked so much. It is called Tir nan og, which is Gaelic, translating as the land of the ever young. It caused a mild panic just before my book was published, when a phone call from a friend in Northern Ireland claimed that it was misspelt. A rapid search of the index in Circe, a biography of Lady Londonderry, disclosed two versions, and some discussion revealed that it was from one of several dialects in the north, each one rendering it slightly different. Panic over. My father, Harry Mitchell, was born in King's Lynn in 1901 and died in 1973. Between 1920 and 1927, he worked for the Londonderrys as an under-butler in a world recovering from the Great War and a flu pandemic. I remembered snippets of the little he told me about living and working at Mount Stewart House in Northern Ireland, such as learning to drive on the Marquis's Rolls-Royce and sailing a yacht on Strangford Loch, probably two Downton Abbey-style perks. He also hinted at a dramatic existence at their Park Lane London residence, Holderness House, later known as Londonderry House, which no longer exists, with parties attended by King George, Queen Mary, and celebrities such as George Bernard Shaw. He may also have worked at Wynyard Hall in County Durham, near the coalfields from which the Londonderry's wealth came. My father left the Londonderrys in 1927 to achieve his ambition to become a London Metropolitan Policeman. This photograph of him was taken at the end of his passing out parade. He remained a policeman until he retired in 1952. He married my mother in 1933. I arrived in 1934, just 9 months later. Charles Londonderry was the 7th Marquess, the first having died in 1821. He lived between 1878 and 1949 and was a prominent Ulster Unionist, the Red Hand of Ulster featuring as a large piece of topiary in the gardens at Mount Stewart. He served as a staff officer during the Great War, having graduated from Sandhurst as a cavalryman. His wife, Edith, the Marchioness, was also born in 1878, living in Dunrobin Castle in Scotland as a girl. She died in 1959. They were prominent members of British society at the time. He was Air Minister in the government in the 30s, and she founded and led the Women's Legion in World War I, encouraging women to help the war effort. The Personal Service League she founded in the 30s, of which the Queen was the patroness, was designed to help the unemployed. She was also very friendly with the nearly 70-year-old Labour Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, which occasioned some gossip. Charlie's chief mistress in the 30s was Olive Murray Smith, a pretty widow. The Londonderrys are buried together in a mausoleum constructed in the gardens of Mount Stewart House. It is on the locked entrance to this that I first noticed Tir Nanog inscribed. I visited Mount Stewart on the 31st of May 1991, eager to try to find out more about what my father had experienced. But before I could get into that, I was bowled over by entering the Castlereagh room. He was the 2nd Marquess and had lived between 1769 and 1822. He had been a Whig politician between 1790 and 1795, but then joined the Tories. This led to him becoming the leader of the House of Commons in Lord Liverpool's government, like today's local MP Rees-Mogg, and between 1812 and 1822 Britain's Foreign Secretary, during Napoleon's retreat from Moscow and at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, when the non-French nations of Europe met to plan the future of Europe in the 19th century. He then returned to England and on 12th August 1822 committed suicide by cutting his throat with a penknife at Loring Hall in Sidcup, Kent. Many years later, between 1955 and 1957, I was a student at Goldsmiths College, London, and played cricket and football for the college. Several of these games were played in the grounds of Loring Hall, by then residential accommodation for Goldsmiths students. When I visited Mount Stewart House in 1991, I took with me some postcards and photographs my father had left when he died, all associated with his Londonderry experience. One of them was a drawing of a pretty young girl, front face and 2 side face, by an artist called Brock and dated 1924. Amazingly, there were 5 artists called Brock operating at this time, and I was unable to identify our man. We joined the guided tour of the house, and as it was finishing, suddenly there was a framed, full-size original in front of us. I showed the guide my postcard and explained the background. He asked me not to leave until he came back, so we arranged to meet in the tea room, and he disappeared. In due course, he appeared in the tea room accompanied by a tall, elegant, grey-haired lady. She proved to be the Londonderry's daughter, Lady Mary. I was very pleased to hear her say, "Oh, Harry Mitchell, yes, I remember him." Mount Stewart House is a very impressive building, well worth a visit, as did the King and Queen in July 1903. Most of the rooms were redesigned by the Marchioness. Its gardens are extensive and varied. At the time we were there, the famous rhododendra and azaleas were a blaze of glorious colour at the rear of the house. The impressive frontage has a number of smaller gardens arranged before it, designed by Edith. One is peopled by a number of stone figures, animals and mythical creatures, called the Dodo Terrace. The figures represent famous guests, such as, for example, W.B. Yeats, who were all given a name which was then transmuted into one of the stone figures. There is one small garden with a statue of a small girl standing on a collection of seashells. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does a garden grow? A tribute to Lady Mary. Lady Mary, who remembered my father, eventually gave Mount Stewart to the National Trust in 1977. She died in the house in the bed she was born in on the 18th of November 2009. During the 30s, war clouds began to gather as the Nazis seized power in Germany. The Londonderrys both threw themselves into efforts to avoid war, despite sharing some of the upper-class attitudes towards Jews characteristic of the British aristocracy of the time. Edith met Hermann Goering more than once and exchanged correspondence with him. She also got involved with the German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, who attended meetings at which the King and Queen were present in London. Edith invited him to Mount Stewart, and he turned up accompanied by a group of SS men who upset everyone with their rowdy behaviour. Interestingly, their chief, Heinrich Himmler, liked porcelain made at the small German town of Allach so much that he insisted that every SS man had to have a piece. Lord Londonderry also tried to influence affairs and even met Hitler in Berlin. All to no avail. The dark clouds of Nazism closed over Mount Stewart and the rest of the world. What I've said so far, I hope, has clarified my motives for writing this poem and providing a useful background of fact. It could, of course, have been written as a prose article. So I now want to move on briefly to look at what is the essence of the poem, how it expresses the emotions and feelings which the experience creates and which it endeavours to recapture. The poem opens with a direct statement of its purpose, my father's associations with the house, and locates it in time. It then expresses my longing for him to be with me again in his prime, and links this with things he did at Mount Stewart during his time there. The scene is set. The next three lines deal with a central problem for me. I was excited to be in a place associated with my father, which had the effect of making me feel close to him. This, however, was counterbalanced with a heightened awareness that he was gone and could not come back. The past is beyond recall. A light flicker of incantatory rhyme, echoing a line in Kipling's The Way Through the Woods, adds an elegiac quality to the awareness. This is reinforced by introducing the Londonderrys and their mausoleum, which addresses the same conundrum, with its rhetorical rejection of death and the longing for a land of the ever young, a place where we live forever and physical beauty never fades. This section opens with a sharper reiteration of the earlier refrain, adding the pain of loss and fading powers, no matter how much we may try to resist them. I am not content, however, with doom and gloom, so introduce Lady Mary, a link with the past, the people, and the place of some 70 years ago. The towering years. Her happy remembrance of my father is given a line to itself. This reminds me of the beauty of the Mount Stewart gardens, which entice visitors from far and wide, the setting for much pleasure over the years. But then my mood begins to change again as I react to some of the darker associations with this gilded world. I call them up. The source of the Londonderry wealth and the contrast with it and the lives of the miners and their families cannot be ignored. The tragic conclusion to Castlereagh's famous career is a central feature of the house, casting a shadow of sadness alongside its historical associations which shaped the Europe of the 19th century. This leads into a final riff recalling the high life my father experienced in the 20s, then highlighting the Londonderry's links with the tumultuous events of the 20th century. The nightmare of Nazism and some of its main progenitors tangled with the Mount Stewart story and left a final stain on its memory. The image of Himmler's porcelain not only draws out the fragility of any notion of peace with Nazis,